All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Really pleased to see how timely everyone is this afternoon. So thank you for that. My name's Sarah Weber, and I'm the President and CEO of C3 Alliance Corp, as well as an independent director of Snowline Gold. And it is my great pleasure to be here emceeing this afternoon's session about First Nations partnerships, economic reconciliation. So we have a couple of program changes that I just want to let you know about. In our first panel with Jordan Peterson, Blair and Yanni are not joining us. However, Tosh Southwick from IRP Consulting will be here. And I also have a very special addition to the program. And now, oh, there he is. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Harlan Schilling, the Deputy Chief of the Delu Dena Council, as well as the CEO of the Center of Excellence of Economic Development, to give us a short presentation. So please join me in welcoming Harlan.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I just want to thank the organizers for squeezing me in last minute. A little bit quick about the BC Center of Excellence and kind of how I've gotten myself into this role. So I am the Deputy Chief of Lower Post for Delu Dena Council, and a couple of years ago, we had the great success on behalf of all First Nations across Canada and Indigenous people around the world of tearing down the residential school. So that was, yes. So that was an enormous feat done by many years of previous leadership for Lower Post and Indigenous people throughout the North to have that building torn down. So a lot of things have changed in Lower Post since then. Since we've torn down in the last 5 years, we've hit roughly about $75 million in infrastructure to our community. We have a great and amazing team that works down there, very dedicated to the people, to the programs that we have. We partnered with BC Housing. Again, Lower Post is right on the BC-Yukon border. So for many years, it was a jurisdictional, geographical nightmare on where we felt belonged. So when we got in, we attacked government and worked with different First Nations in the Yukon and in BC just to make sure our voices were heard. So with that, we were able to complete a $16 million at-risk shelter in Lower Post, 6 units for women and children fleeing violence, 10 units for people at risk of homelessness. We've got a $9 million new water treatment plant. And I'm proud to say, hopefully by Friday, we have secured the last of the $30 million to finish the building that is replacing that residential school. So with that being said, I know I've got 4 minutes left. For the last year, I had the honor of sitting on the board of directors for the BCAFN. As a junior young politician, I started reaching out and seeing that there are a lot more different organizations out there that could help and support Indigenous people. Again, I really dislike that the AFN has Yukon region BC. Again, I'm a true believer of bloodlines, not borders. So very proud that the team that I work with has given me the opportunity to start outreaching and saying, we want to help all First Nations. It doesn't matter if you are in BC, if you are in the Yukon, if there's a team there that can help, we want to help. So the BC Center of Excellence was mandated by the chiefs in BC to put together an organization for a group of people that thrive and do well in economic development. So they're from a resolution back in 2021. It was passed by the BC chiefs to get the BC Center of Excellence up and going. So since September 25th, so I haven't even been in this role for the last 2 months, we have kicked it off and again trying to define what is economic development, which is extremely broad and goes to absolutely every aspect of life. And this is why I have usually a team with me. Oh, there we go. So what is the Center of Excellence? Again, trying to broadly define that. I was with the Chiefs Committee on Economic Development in Ontario last week. And a chief had said there are two things. There's economy and economic development. And I really took that and it resonated with me for the weekend. One of the biggest things I want to try and get us back into is First Nations economy. Getting back into being that way of living that we did hundreds of years ago. Trading clothing, trading food, and everything. Everything in the world is just getting harder. But if we go back to our traditional roots of who we were as Indigenous people, we can thrive again. And I think it's with industry, like people in this room, we can make that happen. So this is just a little bit of the timeline of where the funding was secured for the BCAFN. So right now our funding has strictly come from JEDI. A lot of the young kids all love that we work with the JEDI ministry. So jobs, jobs, economy, diversification, and innovation. So again, we were able to secure roughly around 3.2 million, I believe, on the contingency that we land federal funding. So right now, this is the team that we have with the COE. We are currently expanding on it. I am looking for a CFO, Chief Finance Officer, and then one more senior policy analyst. So myself, I am Casca from Lower Post. Sarah Bain is from Fort Nelson First Nation. Katie Robertson has worked with DALU for a little over 2 years now and does a lot of our policy writing. So the key focuses areas is, yes, bridging the gaps and act as a catalyst to facilitate connection between First Nations and economic development partners. So again, bridging out economic development, so vastly broad. One of the biggest things that we're looking at is international trade. I know the Yukon government, they just sent a delegation to Japan not too long ago. I was in Japan in January of 2023 with Natural Resources Canada. And again, my presentation there is kind of what landed me this job, is telling government and industry that First Nations people have the right and are most likely and willing and wanting to work and help people. But with Japan being, again, a major trade, I believe they're Canada's 5th largest trade partner, and they're looking to move up the list. My messaging is make the Indigenous people your first phone call. You know, it is rightfully so, unsettled, unceded lands, the minerals, the resources that they are often going after, the First Nations people should have a say. So again, this is where the Center of Excellence Economic Development on International Trade is one of the areas that we were trying to help. Also policy research, data gathering, First Nations business capacity. One of the biggest things that I found and learned in First Nation communities is separating business from politics. That was a very big thing for me. My background is the Canadian Armed Forces. I love structure. And structure has been our success. And I think instilling that and working with First Nation chiefs to saying, stay with the politics, be that voice of that your people put you in that position for, and then get people like in this room to help you with your business ventures, and keeping that distinct separation between business and politics. So again, just working on some of our current projects. We are just in the middle of finishing our branding and our website and our logo. Hopefully by end of next week, those will be up and running. And again, looking at ways to get input on First Nations, how we can help them. Almost did it. So I'm all about timing, but again, I just want to thank the organizers. It's very last minute. I am very excited about this. You know, it's been probably one of the biggest honors of my life is serving as a chief for my First Nation. But again, I think, right, yeah, you can only do so many years of politics, business. This excites me. And seeing the excitement that it gives younger people within our nations, I am hopeful. I like to think that I'm just one of the first with a big mouth and a little bit of an education, and I tell government and I tell people there's more coming behind me. So, and I'm hoping that the COE and that we can have partnerships with the Yukon government, with the Yukon First Nations to make this thrive and just make it better tomorrow. So with that, thank you. I'm here for the next 2 days if there's any questions. And again, thank the organizers.
Well, thank you so much, Chief. And yeah, I really appreciate that. It is exciting news, just announced last month in October. So I would consider this a sneak peek, and then perhaps there's going to be a longer update next year. Now, next, I would like to invite our next panel up to the stage, and I would like to introduce the moderator to you today. Jordan Peterson is the Principal and Chief Disruptor of Affinity North, an Indigenous-owned consultancy dedicated to empowering communities and fostering sustainable growth. He's also currently a board advisor to Northwest Tel and a board member of the Nacho-Nayagdun Development Corp. So today, their title of the panel is Economic Reconciliation, What It Means. And I will let Jordan introduce his panelists, but please join me in welcoming the panel today.
Thank you. Before we do start off, I just want to Another round of applause for Harlan. Great job, and looking forward to it. And just a bit more about myself. I'm originally from Aklavik, Northwest Territories. I've lived in the Yukon for the last 4 years. Former Deputy Grand Chief of the Gwich'in Tribal Council. And just wanting to also acknowledge the land that we sit on and the land that we've been gathering on the last couple of days, and ensure that we have a really great conversation here today. So with that, I want you both to introduce yourself, because the list is long and we don't have a lot of time, so I'll look to you both to be succinct in your introductions.
Oh, great. I'll say for those of the folks of you that are standing, there's like a whole bunch of seats right up front here. No pressure. There you go. See? So my name is Tosh Southwick. I'm a citizen of Klawani First Nation. I belong to the Wolf Clan. I think Burwash is the center of the universe, so I'm a little biased on that. If not the center of the universe, the most beautiful. You should have gone first. My background is diverse, but I've spent my entire career working to advance Indigenous self-determination and reconciliation. I currently am running a small consulting firm called IRP Consulting with my business partner, Davida Wood from Teslin. IRP stands for Inspiring Reconciliation Potential. We work with different organizations across sectors, but only cool organizations who truly get it and want to move mountains. And do so in the north. We're interested in the north. In addition to that, I also sit on a number of development corps for my own First Nation, Klawani First Nation. Again, I'm a little biased. I think our dev corps rock. We've got some amazing... Oh, Stephen Mooney's in the house. Thanks, Stephen. And then in addition to that, I also sit on a number of boards and committees throughout the Yukon, trying to make sure that we are moving in the right direction as fast as we can, but in a good way.
Gee, she's also part of the Klawani Mafia, so don't take it lightly what she has to say. Good afternoon, Gulchish Shikachwan, for this opportunity. My name is Peter Johnston. I'm a member of the Teslin Tlingit Council, which she mentioned in her opening comments is the second best place in the world to live, but I had the fortunateness, I guess, to grow up in Teslin through the 70s and 80s, through the whole political climate. My father was leader of our community as chief for almost 15 years and a signatory to Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. So when it talks about the power of influence, let alone the power of responsibility, I think I carry that with me every day now, in the fact that I'm a father of 4, but also the responsibility of our leaders and our elders and the people that have gone on before us, let alone the ones that are striving for success today. And it's tough because we live in this world that is not always built for First Nations, even in our own economies, let alone which we're going to talk about, but even in our own territory. As I mentioned earlier in my discussion, forums such as this, we were not necessarily always welcome to. And I think today, the fact that we are now leading some of the discussion, I think really bodes well to where we as a territory is now evolved into probably being one of the models in Canada for good governance, let alone good partnership. And I think when we talk about economic reconciliation, we could look to many different opportunities that we've created, including these two fine people that I'm sitting with are very much movers and shakers as well. So I think the more that we take on the opportunity rather than the role of the victim, and I use that word in a very respectful way, but we are victims of circumstance even in our own country. And I think when we take to that place of taking our rightful place again, which is being in the economy, we'll have not only the opportunities for success, but when we're successful as First Nation people here, we're all successful as humanity, let alone as a country. So with that, thank you. And sheesh.
I think this panel, there's going to be a lot of highs, a lot of lows, a lot of laughing. We always seem to have a ton of fun when we're together. So, but looking back at the history and kind of this first generation that hasn't been forced to go to residential school and controlled by the Indian agent, and that we now look at the Yukon as leaders in not just governance, but reconciliation and the way that we come together in partnership. And I wanted to share a quote with you all from J.P. Gladue, a close friend of mine. With economic equality, Indigenous peoples have the potential to unlock hundreds of billions of dollars for the Canadian economy. Without economic reconciliation, our unequal trade relationship will continue. And we face a unique opportunity to remake the once vibrant relationship between Indigenous peoples and businesses in the rest of Canada. Given that quote and this history, shared history that we have of moving from the Indian agent to self-governance, I'm just wondering if you can maybe both share your views on and experience in terms of economic reconciliation, and maybe if you could mention some specific initiatives that you're working on that contributes towards that.
Yeah, I will say, first, I love that quote. Second, oh, hi, Kathy. I will say, in my mind, we've reached a tipping point in the Yukon. The easy reconciliation conversations are being had. The low-hanging fruit is done. Now we're getting down to the crunch of it, and that is definitely true in economic reconciliation. I can sort of sort the companies that we work with into 3 baskets, and I can do so probably in the first hour of talking to them. Are they serious about it? Do they get it? Or are they being forced to do it? Have they read our final agreements and understand what that context is in the Yukon? And third, are they willing to actually do the work differently? Or is it about them trying to get us on side to their way they've already done it? And I will say in the Yukon, at least in my experience, we're moving towards, look, if you don't get it, you're not serious about it, you haven't resourced it, you don't have the capacity to do it, come back to me when you do, because there's 15 people behind you that do. And so I look very carefully for businesses that we partner with. Do they have a reconciliation statement? Have they resourced reconciliation within their industry, within their company? Do they have a reputation? Street cred means a lot in the North. I'm gonna ask, I got cousins in every one of the 14 First Nations. I'm gonna ask them, did you piss them off in Teslin? I'm gonna find out. And vice versa for Kelowna. So reputation means a lot up here. And you know, I'm definitely looking to party. I'm looking up, right?
Well,
Partner.
it's woman in mining tonight, so.
Oh, I could get rowdy. Sue, will you be my date? Where's Sue Harris? I seen her earlier. She could be my date. So for me, the perfect examples, I want companies to embrace being an Air North, being an Alcan Air. I want to look for not just shares in the company. I want to look for impact. I want to look for decision making, and I want to look for long-term, not short-term pieces. So the companies that come up and say, look, we're so excited to work with your nation, your community, we want to hire one of your citizens 0.25 for 3 months. No, I want to hire all the citizens we can hire. The government wants to hire them all that we can hire, and we need long-lasting relationship building. And so we're looking for those pieces. I've seen industry companies that can do it really well. I've seen industry companies who are struggling but authentically are trying to learn. And I've seen companies who are dragging their heels. So there's a variety there for me.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that when we use the word trade, that was based on our economies back in the day. And as an inland Tlingit, where we traditionally came from the southeast coast of Alaska, we had the relationship with the Russians in the early 1600s, which provided us that relationship with the interior nations here through trade, and didn't really realize and resonate until we started talking about even words in Southern Shoshone such as salt. That word came from Tlingit, and once you think about how that influenced, let alone the opportunities we had not only to intermarry, but also to see the benefits of good trade. And as mentioned, if you're not in that relationship for the good or the betterment of the nation, let alone within the context of us as a territory, we went to war. Where today, when we look at reconciliation, I think until we get to that place where we as First Nation, let alone Indigenous people, can reconcile with the indifferences, and I go back to where we've been the product of since 1492, we've been disrupted in the base of our own economies, let alone our own societies, for the ultimate need of commodity, which back in the day was probably slavery as being probably the highest commodity in this world, let alone the spices and the minerals that we have the pleasure of today of having in our economies. But I think the significance, as Tosh has mentioned, that we need to have processes that are going to support development. And we can all stand up and say, yes, well, is it working for us? Well, for us as First Nation, it's a tool that can be utilized to the full extent, which it ups the game, if you will, when it comes to not only environmental monitoring, but also the significant steps that it takes to build a project. However, there are certain gaps that I think that we can expedite and to alleviate some of that pressure, because It doesn't support the economy when we're in these places of sticking points. And I think a lot of, unfortunately, the sticking points comes down to the attitude, and it's the political will, let alone the fact that, and within a short few years, our rights as First Nations in this territory will be up for the election and the campaign promises once again. So I think it's important, as mentioned, to ensure that we build strong relationships based on that, that you want to be here, that you want to do the extra lifting, you want to go the extra mile, you want to be the company that has not only the reputation in the community, but you back it up through solid investment. And it's not about just supporting great functions such as Yukon Night here, but it's supporting the local hockey team in the community that you may be working in, or providing a hot lunch program to the school, or whatever it may be. So I see, and those are my examples, because I've been in politics so long, I haven't been in business, in which in a year and a half short ways away, I'll be looking at things in a different way. But I want to look at it not from a perspective of myself generating wealth. And I think that's what traditionally we always, our vision as First Nations is, how many people can we bring along in this conversation? Because if we're all successful in this room, then you just think of the possibilities that we can do it as a territory. And I think we are one of the best places to invest. Secondly, we have the political legacy now after 30 years of implementation. And I can go on in regards to all the shining examples of where we've been able to have success, but it does come with the price of failure, right? We've all invested in sawmills in the territory and lost money in a sense of where that was. But, in my case in Teslin, we try to do it all rather than take the partnership to the level that we can. So thank you.
There was no sawmills invested in Kluane, just saying.
Yeah, there you are.
Coming kind of full circle, thinking about the history of Yukon First Nations, thinking about the history of the Indian Act and how it's applied towards our people. Up until the mid-1950s, we couldn't practice ceremony. And my question to you, to help inform the crowd, to help inform mining companies, mining executives, those that are working for environmental companies as well, what role does ceremony play in our First Nation economies?
Well, I think it comes back to process too, and it's funny because even when we get into these kind of engagements, even just having the opening prayer last night for dinner, I was just like, I could feel the tension in the room when it comes to just even, and when we talk about prayer, for us, it's not about praising Jesus or looking at things in a sense of, it's not materialistic items. So when we do prayer, it's about giving, being grateful. And if we as humans could be a little bit more giving and grateful for the world that we live in, let alone your health, because your health will become the new wealth as we move and evolve in our history as human beings. I think the more that we can find these places where we need to not only reflect on who we are as a people, but here in First Nation culture, ceremony from the time that you're conceived to the point, and not that that's a ceremony, I should say, but what I should say is when the baby is in the womb, sorry, that relationship has already started with the mother and the family, and how we not only hold that.
Some view it as ceremony, though.
That's right. How we look at that person that's not even been born into this world, and how we honor them through this whole processes of birthing, let alone how they're incorporated as mentioned earlier, the roles that we play in our community. I think the more that we can have ceremony, and we lose a lot because there's a lot of our people, and I'm not going to name names, that are totally way the hell out to lunch, and then we have to take 25 minutes just to have a prayer, and so it weakens our perspective. But really, when we look at ceremony, it's about how do we recognize cultural practices, which we've lost, but how do we honor them today in today's context? And it's simple things, once again, as just honoring the meal that we're about to have, and all those things that we take very seriously in our culture. And unfortunately, with the impacts of residential school, let alone enfranchisement policy, the Indian Act, the residential, all these things that have affected us, we've lost that touch with ceremony and the ability for us as individuals, what role we play in regards to a bigger context. And I think when we talk about the economy, we as individuals just want to be a part of the room, right? When we look at the education system, we want to see our reflection in not only the seats that are sitting or the people that are sitting in them, but the environment that we live in. And so I think ceremony could be utilized in a way that we honor each other as well, right? And I think those elements of business, or those elements could be incorporated into your business plan quite seamlessly without feeling awkward like we did last night for the opening prayer. So thank you.
I'll just add that I think ceremony has a place in business in many intersect. One of the ones that I say from the beginning is it's a really powerful tool when things get stuck. And when you're talking about reconciliation, things get stuck. And so when we allow space for ceremony, it can be powerful that way. I think ceremony for me is big things and small things. Ceremony is also about respecting the interconnectedness. And if you work with First Nations, you'll often say, I don't understand why we're having this conversation. It has nothing to do with the business at hand. But in First Nation way, that interconnectedness, and so ceremony is interconnected with prosperity. Ceremony is interconnected with well-being. Those things are tied together. And lastly, I'll say ceremony has a place in business because it's respectful. If I have to deal with procurement, you have to deal with ceremony.
On that note, my next question, funny enough, is on procurement. And I think we all know there's issues with the Yukon First Nations procurement policy. I wonder if maybe you have any thoughts as to what private sector can do to improve it.
Well, I have a lot of comments because unfortunately I was the poster boy for this whole procurement policy. Even though my team was working at it intimately and in the internal discussion, it really doesn't affect CYFN, the Council of Yukon First Nations, as a central body. It's meant as an economic tool which will allow us to have some place of inequality when it comes to the business community. Go back to my discussion earlier today, we weren't allowed to work in this country until the 60s. So my grandmother's wealth, now that she's passed on, wasn't about passing on that the monetary wealth, right? The wealth that she passed on to me was based on that culture and that tradition, which I hold sacred, which is priceless to me in my world. But hopefully down the road we can talk about this legacy of cultural, where we leave, you know, I'm hoping that I'll be able to leave some money behind for my children. How do we build on creating, you know, all these opportunities for legacy? And so when we talk about business, and it was tough because of the fact that I mentioned this morning too, government is very linear in their thinking, right? They don't think from a circular perspective of gathering more information. And God bless the minister that tried to incorporate this without really talking to the business community. One of the, probably the biggest affected proponents of this whole policy is the business community, and not having that discussion, you know, that intimate discussion on how the business community could help support, you know, the procurement policy for what it is. And they go back to equality. Until we are at that sense of equality here in the territory when it comes to the economy, then we can talk about equality. But unfortunately, we're still generations behind. I think when we talk about the energy discussion in this territory, we're already behind in that sense. And yet the next you know, project, let alone growth in population, we're going to feel the significant deficit when it comes to energy production, let alone the continuity and the consistency that we need, not only for good projects, but also even in the month of February, you know, we all need to have a generator in our house. So I think the procurement policy, what I'm trying to say, could have been done better. And how do we incorporate the business community voice today? And I think today we see a lot of, and not to name names, a lot of even our own First Nation companies that are just checking the box and not even doing the heavy lifting within their own nations or in their governments to ensure that capacity is being built, the training components are added, the cultural and traditional and the ceremonies being incorporated. We're just taking our 2% or our 5% and leaving, and it's not helping us and the evolution of what we're trying to evolve to where we at least get to the place where, you know, we struggle with even working together as a collective as 14 nations, because we're all at different levels as well, and it's a lot of different levels of education and you know, experience as well. And you know, the reason why Kelowna didn't invest in a sawmill, because they've seen two bad examples just down the road, right? So I'd like to think those examples, you know, our failures led to their success of not maybe going down that path. So I think the procurement policy could be done well. I just don't know how do we retract some of those objectives to ensure that, you know, everybody's following the game equally. And the biggest default I see today is that government does not have the report card or the benchmark or how are they gauging this as a success as well? And I think that's the missing deficit in this whole thing, is that there's no accountability. What?
Yeah, what? That's okay. I have strong feelings about procurement generally, First Nation procurement policy as well. I blame CYFN that I'm now on a committee that I spend a lot of my time on called the MRC about First Nation procurement policy. I'll say a few things on it, but I think it deserves a much bigger conversation. One, it's 15%. That's not where we started. The sky's not falling. Like, it's 15%. It's a very small number of a huge amount of money in the territory. If it was up to First Nations, that number would be closer to 30. So that was a compromise in itself. And so I don't have a lot of time to entertain conversations about, why 15% is so high, because in my mind, it's so low. Is the policy perfect? Absolutely not. But show me one government policy that comes out and is perfect. Like, you can't. It needs work. But in my mind, it's trailblazing for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is a number of young Indigenous entrepreneurs who actually believe they have a shot now, where they didn't 3 years ago. And so for me, that's moving mountains. Industry partners, I have a lot of time for the industry partners who are like, yeah, I get it, we gotta do this work differently. I have even more time for the industry partners to say, yeah, I get it, we gotta do it differently. How can I work with you? I don't have the patience for companies that think they can fix us in our communities. We're not broken. We know what we need. We know what we need to be successful. We just need partners to do it. And so the true partnership, and I'll go back to relationship, underpinning every conversation about economic reconciliation is key. And I think there's some industry players out there that are gonna make a big difference in the procurement policy. They're gonna partner on workforce initiatives. And I think we're gonna we're gonna solve the challenges around capacity together. We won't do it when we're separate. Those aren't the companies that are gonna succeed. The players that are spending time to try and game the system, I don't think there's nearly as many as people think there are. They're gonna get tired out right away. It's just not worth the energy in this piece. And it's such a minute payoff compared to long-standing, long-term relationships that take that energy. And so I think those companies that go down that road will, 10 years from now, be way more successful, not just in their labor market and their labor force, but in their ability to navigate on complex projects and to be strategic. I come from a really small community. If we do more than 2 major projects in 5 years, we're in trouble. We don't have a workforce. We don't have places for you to eat. We don't got places for you to sleep. We have to be very strategic.
Best place in the world.
Oh, ouch!
Where the hell are you staying?
Well, I don't know where you're staying next time you're out there. So we have to be strategic, and I think we're having conversations now with industry that we weren't having a number of years ago, and that to me is a success.
This has been a great panel so far. We've got 11 minutes left. I've got a couple more questions, and kind of just bringing it to a place of thinking about economic disparity, and that the procurement policy serves as an example, as steps forward to kind of make or bring us to a more equal position with the rest of Canada. And I look at some of the mining companies across Canada, or even just oil and gas companies that have learned how to walk through the front door and partner with Indigenous nations from the start, that are super successful. And we think about the systemic barriers and colonial policies that have led us to this position, but also a lot of work that's gone into the last 50 years of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, to self-government, to land claims, and that cup of tea is not for everyone. But when we do talk about economic disparity, I think most nations across this country will agree that it exists. And I think, without reconciliation, or to achieve reconciliation, or at least the pursuit of reconciliation, we need truth. And that's the truth, that First Nations, Indigenous people across the country are in a reduced economic position because of government policies and colonialism. And thinking about that, and how could we develop some thoughts or policies or regulatory regimes that will allow for nations to be able to have equity ownership in projects, but also participate more meaningfully in our economies here in the Yukon and across Canada?
I think it's access to capital, and I think that's where, you know, we've been fortunate to get compensation dollars, and we've been able to negotiate some levies on that, so we can be able to use those dollars to be able to invest in our community. So we've been able to buy into airlines and wineries in British Columbia, for instance, and other great investments that we see in economic return. So I think for us as to create that sense of balance, we need that access to capital. So we need great government funding programs that can not only support us, and I think, you know, we're one of the biggest Cannor offices, which we've benefited to a certain degree from, and, you know, and so we do need institution, but we also need, you know, people that understand, and I think that can build on the economy through just the sense of groups that have money, right? And it does come down to dollars. I think that can help build, you know, some level playing field, but at the same time, there's a whole list of priorities that we need to develop within our community. And I mentioned earlier that, you know, without having that economic base in our communities, it's tough for us to have that sense of community. So it's tough because I think we're still very looked upon as maybe not being accountable as well in this country. And there's a lot of deficits as you mentioned, when it comes to community stability and the whole chief and council processes. But I think the access to capital is probably one of our biggest things that we need more ability to access and to gain, and then we can do more things, I think, to a certain degree. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, I totally agree on the capital. I think when I was starting my own business, I can't tell you the number of banks and lenders we went to that laughed. We're like, you want to do what? Reconciliation is not a business. How are you going to do that? So 3 years later, I'm like, sucks to be you guys. Could have been all in that. If it wasn't for the Bank of Canada, like the BDC team, and actually having a shot at saying, no, explain to me. And you know, the amount of people that said we need a business plan, you bring them a business plan, like, no, that's not a business plan. We need something else. So we need all of these different pieces. So I totally agree on the capital part. I think relief. Phew. I think the other thing that First Nations need is a really clear set of expectations, particularly outside of the Yukon. When I go south, I'm continually reminded of how much further ahead we are in this context. Because I have colleagues, I have family who are like, what do you mean you're sitting in a room with a premier in industry to talk about energy? Like, that's not their norm. And so those expectations need to be broadened across the country. And there's provincial changes. Like, you can see a very different degree of reconciliation as you move across the country. It is totally different in BC than it is in other parts, and same thing with the Yukon. So expectations and standards, I think, need to be there, and governments have a place in that piece. I think there also has to be something to be said about supporting Indigenous communities for their priority areas. And I'd be really in the spirit of honesty, Jordan, Peter, know that that's my way. You want to come and talk in my community about critical mineral resources. I want to talk about the number of people we're losing to opioids. I want to talk about the toxic drug supply. I want to talk about the fact that my community is the only community that does not have an RCMP presence in the Yukon. That you can make a phone call on a Tuesday and say this happened. And the exact answer I got yesterday was, we may or may not be there next week. That's what I want to talk about, because they're interconnected, right? And so it is, I think, impossible to, and I think to Harlan's comment, to separate economic development, First Nation participation in the economy, and the states of our communities. And so I want to see them more brought together, and I applaud industry who's been at the forefront of creating legacy projects that are actually wanted and needed by Indigenous communities, not just things that they think are going to be important.
I promise you all that we didn't sit for days planning this out, because Tosh keeps just leading into my next question every single time. And it's around GDP and the way that we currently measure our economies. I'm wondering if you can give some examples of other ways that we can do that.
I mean, I'll just jump in to say that I'll give you an example of a story. When we're talking about shifts in education systems, normally people say, well, I care what grades my kids get. I care how successful they are in school. But the single biggest predictor for your kids' success in school isn't their grades. It's whether or not they feel like they belong. That's the single biggest predictor. But yet we build systems on grades. And the same is true for the economy. If when we're talking about GDP, the single biggest predictor for me for Indigenous communities isn't always, how much money are they producing? How much product are they producing? It's, are they involved? Are they at the decision-making table? Are they participating as true partners? There's a big difference for me on Big C consultation when companies come out and government comes out and says, here, we're informing you of our plans, versus we're going to co-design this project. And so how we can produce and contribute to GDP, I think, is very varied than the traditional sense. And the last part that I'm going to say is we are just starting to see some of the big pressures. Like energy, huge shifts are coming in those conversations with Indigenous communities. Water, clean water, all of those pieces, renewables. And so for me, the GDP conversation needs to get broader, faster, and it needs to be more culturally appropriate in order for it to be reflective of the reality.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, the energy projects, just the transmission line to join us with the energy sector in the south, I think is going to be a massive project that's not only going to have the benefits and ripple effects for generations to come, but also that opportunity within a very short time frame as well. We need to be ready to be a collective. And I think when we talk about the GDP, you know, we've been very fortunate to have self-government, let alone the negotiations, because in these processes, you know, the federal government, the municipality, all these levels of government, let alone the community, are all involved. And I think through the dips and the ebbs and flows of the mining industry, when the commodity prices are good and bad, at least the self-government, let alone the discussion, let alone the negotiations, are still continuing on, which allows us to have, you know, we're pretty heavy loaded when it comes to government. I think it was upwards of 60% of the people that live in the territory that are of able working force work for government in one mean or the other. So I think when we talk about the opportunities for economic generation, and energy being probably the biggest opportunity coming forward, because I think we really missed some opportunities based on political differences. Back in the day, we could have been owners in Northwest Tel, for instance, not that we want to be associated with that necessarily, or Yukon Energy or ATCO, all these things now that we're...
How long did you work at Northwest Tel?
3.5 years, to be exact. But anyways, I mean, I think we're not benefiting from that long-term legacies of good decision-making, let alone negotiations, based on the attitude in the room in a lot of cases. So I think the more that we can see the benefit of involving people at the ground level and incorporating, as mentioned, you know, the sense of community, I think we can see the benefits long-term to what it comes to creating, because how do we define that? Because I think in our traditional ways of values, we value the native annual native tournament as one of the biggest GDPs for the city of Whitehorse, which generates in the 4-day tournament almost $4 million to the economy of Whitehorse. And for us, it's one of the biggest celebrations that we host next to the native grad. But for the city of Whitehorse, they sit here and benefit from that. So how are they accommodating this to ensure that it could be even better, right? So I think there is so many great examples to where we can do better, but and even just look at things such as hockey, which is very important to this territory as well as a possible economy improver or escalator or whatever the word we're looking for here. So,
you know, I'm just going to jump on that piece to say I think some of the biggest struggles we have in this country with GDP and in this territory with diversification of our economy are going to be responded to by First Nations. It used to be true that it mattered where you were born. Being from a big city center was an asset. But we have young Indigenous entrepreneurs that have proved that wrong now. You can run a design company from Ross River. You can run a tech company from Teslin. And so it is that innovation, that seed of innovation. And I don't want to say governments aren't innovative, but I'm gonna. The entrepreneurs, industry companies, that expansion will help the GDP in so many realms. So how can you lift up those young entrepreneurs? How can you create space for them to enter through the doors that they want to enter through? And remove barriers. There are so many barriers for economic participation from Indigenous companies, Indigenous entrepreneurs, and from communities that there's lots of work to do.
Thank you for that. And before I give a summary of our conversation, I do want to open it up to the floor for one question. And if I don't choose you, it's on purpose. I'm going to be really selective, so if someone does have a question, no? Now's your chance.
Stress them out now.
Can you give us an example of one of your industry partners that really does it right, that's doing it the right way?
Yeah, and I'll tell you this answer is different right now. I'm going to call out NVD. NVD is an industry, they have lots of different industries, but in the last few years, it's been remarkable for me, the advancement in understanding that First Nations don't just want profit. They actually want a seat at the table. They want to design the projects in their community. It is, in my mind, a true statement to say, if you can help us empower our nations to be successful, I'm interested in your partnership. If you are going to create barriers and obstacles, I'm less interested in you coming to my community. And I think NVD's made some really big shifts in that. I'm also going to point out Archer Cathro. I don't know if anybody is in the room for Archer Cathro, for two reasons. One, I think they've taken a big stance back to say, hold on a second, how are we, because they've always been a proud Yukon company, for sure. Always had really good rates of local hire, all of those pieces. But how can we be more of an asset? And more importantly, I've seen Archer Cathro start to say, how can we be an agent of change in advancing reconciliation? And that is rare among some industries. And so I point out to them to say I think that they are ones that I point out.
But I want to say, and counteract your discussion, NDVD, very Northern Visions Development, a lot of great work, 40% owned by First Nation, maybe almost 50 now. But they've utilized that opportunity through that First Nation exposure, that relationship to get them where they are today. And I'm sorry they've taken advantage of us in the same breath, because they pitted us against each other, because we were once the fine owners of the Yukon Inn. We had a Six Nations sat there. Not that we're trying to bring up garbage here, but I'm just trying to say where people have taken advantage. It's a very fine line, but they've utilized the First Nation identity. Now they're a First Nation owned company, but that dollar started from wealth in Calgary, right? The wealth wasn't generated here. So we got to be careful on how we promote people, and Rich Thompson has done a lot of great work. And I think really when you talk about how they've listened to their shareholders, and we have our own people sitting there, now the investments are happening in places that, like CarMax, that may never have been profitable before. They have now been able to take that dollar and been able to utilize that. So you got to, in the same breath, I think we got to be cautious, but at the same time, when there's good example and progressive thinking, and you have a powerhouse such as people that are Yukoners, that have long-term Yukoners, that have really given the foresight and the forecasting for them to benefit from that. So I think those are great examples too, so thank you.
Thank you both for those really great points. And just in terms of the conversation today, I think to kind of answer the question, economic reconciliation, what is it? I think it's those strategic partnerships and respectful partnerships, and walking through the front door when you have a project in the traditional territory of any of the nations across the Yukon. It's access to capital so that we can, and not just capital, but maybe patient capital, to ensure that we can meaningfully participate and become equity owners in projects. And thinking about what are the priority areas of individual nations when you're going and having conversations with them. And then the question of do we belong, and the want and need to belong in these economies. And I think a really big piece here is a seat at the table, and we're starting to see now corporations across the country, including CIBC that just announced Mark Padlosky as a board of director, as an example, and that we not just want, but we need a seat at the table. We need to be equity partners, and to be able to generate that wealth that we talk about, that's not just about profits, but rather about how are we creating stronger, more successful communities. So must see to the both of you for the time.
Cheesh, thank you.